So when I was thinking about this talk and trying to figure out how to wrap a concept, I've been chasing historical records and trying to use historical records to help me understand mangrove ecology. And I came up with all kinds of symbology. So to this idea of searching the historical records to tell me something about the future. So I came up with a wine bottle on a beach with a letter in it. Another set of my slides had Doctor Who's TARDIS in there, so time travel to chase mangroves. But anyway, this crystal ball is I think a better icon for what I'm trying to do is to dig after what seems to be unrelated historical tidbits and use the past to help interpret or even just know about the past to be able to interpret and predict what might happen with climate change with respect to mangroves. So you all probably have seen mangroves, right? So you've been to the Everglades, and if you go to the Everglades, that's the kind of mangrove you see. In fact, if you go just about any place in the Caribbean and you're on a boat, that's the kind of mangrove you're going to see. This particular picture, though, was taken in Panama, in Bocas del Toro, Panama. This is the red mangrove. This is a little tidal creek, and it represents what most people's view of mangroves is. It's these arching prop roots. This is sort of the prototypical mangrove forest. If you go to Indo-Pacific, Indonesia, or Australia, or wherever, you go into mangrove forests. Not the same species, but you still have these same kind of growth forms in those mangroves on the other side of the world. They look pretty much the same. But just to get us all on the same footing, I want to go through, give you a little background on what mangroves are, so that we all, when I use words or talk about these mangroves, you know where I'm coming from. So this is just a little primer on mangrove ecology to get started. And I hope to I want to make sure everybody knows what a mangrove is and how do mangroves differ from other plants. We'll come away knowing that, I hope. Where they occur and some differences among the different kinds of mangroves. And sort of the thread that I hope to carry through this talk is how mangroves are going to respond to climate change. How is climate change going to affect the distribution, and particularly of mangroves along this east coast of Florida. And I want to take you through some of these historical records that reveal the past of mangroves to help us anticipate what's going to happen in the future. And then maybe we can talk a little about the ecological consequences of those changes. So that other picture was what the prototypical view of mangroves, but we have mangroves here. And this particular photograph was taken right out there. That's also a mangrove forest. So as climate is changing, it's causing a shift of vegetation. The mangroves, which are more tropical, warm weather plants, are able to move and survive in this climate. The winters are a little warmer than they used to be. And there's this poleward shift that's happening, and it's causing a change in the distribution of many species, including mangroves. And not just the shift in the species, it's change in the phenology when they flower, the abundance of more temperate plants relative to tropical plants is changing. And the mangroves are not moving into a vacuum. They are displacing native species that are already here. And in mangrove case, they are moving into salt marshes. And that's a balancing act. You have probably, if you've lived here very long, you've seen these systems going from almost pure salt marsh to trees, shrubs coming up and getting thicker and thicker. So this is happening, and it's happening so fast that we can see it from year to year. Let's see. So mangroves occur primarily in the tropics, from Florida to southern Brazil, along the in the Atlantic Ocean, and in this part of the world, they are dominated by one species. This is that red mangrove. That's from Florida to Brazil. That's the dominant species, but there's a couple other species mixed in that are quite common, the black mangrove, the white mangrove. And as you go further south, there's a total of about 9 species in this neotropical area. And like salt marshes in the temperate zone, mangroves are an assemblage of salt-tolerant, flood-tolerant plants growing in estuaries alongside coasts and rivers. They are not a taxonomic grouping. It's not like different interrelated species. These are 9 different families of plants have mangroves in them. They are assembled by ecological features rather than taxonomic features. And one of the first things people talk about when they talk about mangrove ecosystems is zonation. And this is the red mangrove we're talking about, but there's a zonation pattern that is characteristic of mangroves. As you go from the wet area, you can see where the vegetation zones look uniform. Well, they are uniform. That's almost exclusively one species. Then it transitions into another species. So this characteristic zonation you see that in mangrove forests all over the world. You'll have just vast areas of one species, and they're arranged along tidal gradients. So the trees along the fringe will be one thing. As you go inland from that, you'll get another species, but a huge band of it. So you transition in these horizontal bands relative to the shoreline. Oops, wrong one. So there's other characteristics that make a mangrove a mangrove. They have morphological specializations. Like this is the inside of a red mangrove forest. So the obvious morphological characteristic here, or adaptation to this environment, are these arching prop roots. And those prop roots have pores on them, the pneumatophores, that allow air to go down into the root system. This is as you can see, it's a flooded system. It's flooded all the time. So the substrate below ground, it's all anaerobic. These plants still need air to carry on normal metabolism. So these pores let air go down to the root system. And the air actually leaks out and creates a little oxidized rhizosphere that allows these plants to live in this environment. But these mangroves also have physiological specialization, dealing with salt, for example, or dealing with those anaerobic soils. It's very, salt is toxic to most plants, but so to be able to live in a salty world like mangroves and salt marshes takes some considerable physiological specialization. Mangroves also are, I said that mangroves are an assemblage of different taxonomic groups, but within a group, like the red mangrove, for example, that's the genus Rhizophora. So all species within the genus Rhizophora are mangroves. Like Avicennia, which is the black mangrove, all Avicennias are black mangroves. So there is taxonomic isolation at the generic level. Another characteristic that makes mangroves different from other plants is that they have something called vivipary. So that means that the plant goes from flowering to fertilized flower to something equivalent to a seed to a germinated plant while it's still attached to the parent plant. There's no dormant phase. And I brought something. What did I do with it? Here it is. For example, I know you've all seen these. These are propagules, this is a propagule from the red mangrove. And it looks like a bean, but it's not a bean. This is actually the root. So this plant is already germinated, and it floats. Initially it floats like this, and then it floats like that. And it forms little lateral roots from here, and these are what anchor it. But if you did a cross-section through this part of the plant, you'd see it's typical of root anatomy. The closest thing to a seed part of this is this. These are the cotyledons. You know, when you open a bean, it comes into a... This is what's the remnants of the cotyledon. It's a little circular thing. And this part here is what becomes the tree. This tiny little part is the epicotyl. And you get tree. And so this is a viviparously produced, so it went from flower to this as a continual development. So no resting dormant phase. This disperses, floats off to someplace. Propagules, it's usually referred to as a propagule because it isn't a seed. It's already germinated, it's ready to go. And I have here, I don't know if you're interested afterwards, you're welcome to take a look. This is the propagule of the black mangrove. I know you've seen that. They're right now, there are just millions of these outside. And this is the propagule of the white mangrove. So these guys are also germinated, but their root is inside, and they're more, it's more cryptic, but nevertheless. So these are the reproductive units of the 3 species of mangroves that we have here and throughout the neotropics. These are the propagules of the red mangrove. There's another characteristic of these mangroves. I mentioned this horizontal zonation, but mangroves also have this vertical zonation. So you get the above ground part, a tree, right? It's typical terrestrial trees, birds nesting, lizards, whatever. But it's living in a flooded situation, so there's an intertidal zone. And the roots go below the water, so there's a subtidal zone. So there's this very characteristic vertical zonation, and which amplifies the diversity of habitats associated with this plant. So if you go into the Florida Keys and go snorkeling one of the creeks, you see these roots are covered in all kinds of macroalgae and marine invertebrates, very colorful communities. Not so colorful here, but nevertheless, these roots form this hard substrate that tons of things settle on. And then the intertidal portion is, however big the tide is, you get this intertidal zone right on these roots, and that's also a very distinctive community, very characteristic plants and animals that live in that part of the mangrove. And if you go into a black mangrove forest, this is similar to what we have here. There's the trees, and the ground is covered with these, the aerial root in this system are these vertical little things that stick up. These are part of the root system. We call them pneumatophores, and they have also glands on them that are pores that let air down into the root system. And there are the propagules, which we have here. You're welcome to take a look at those. And the pneumatophores. On the left side here, you see a pure salt marsh. And this is what you see if you go from, I don't know, Ponte Vedra north to Newfoundland. These are the typical salt marsh. And on the right is a mangrove forest. So you see this obvious difference in structure. This salt marsh system is herbaceous. 100% of that above ground biomass dies back every year. So that re-enters the system, and you get new plants growing from those culms of root systems that, like any perennial, would come back in the spring. But in mangroves, you got this huge amount of woody perennial biomass. Only about 20% of that biomass and senescent leaves recycles each year. So you get this huge difference in structure, and you get this huge difference in the way the ecosystem recycles its nutrients. Both mangroves and salt marshes have that characteristic to form these pure stands. So you go out and you see forever spartina, or the same thing with the mangroves. So they're similar in that sense, but very different in this herbaceous versus woody system. So what I've been working on is looking at how these systems are changing with climate change. In the north here we have pure mangroves, and that's from around 30 degrees north and further north. There's about a 2 degrees of latitude zone from, say, Cocoa Beach to St. John's River. There's an area where you got mangroves and salt marsh co-occurring. It's the transition from pure mangroves in the south, like here, to pure salt marshes in the north. We have that transition zone, or an ecotone. So it's an ecotone between the tropical systems to the south and the temperate systems to the north. So as climate is changing, this ecotone is shifting. One of the questions I have is, does the top of the ecotone and the bottom of the ecotone, do they shift together? I'm not 100%. I thought yesterday or maybe the day before that they did. Today I changed my mind. I think there's some other things going on. Don't do that. Did you guys hear that? Oops. I forgot to do this. All right. If anybody calls, that's their problem. All right. So anyway, there's this 2 degrees of latitude where we have this ecotone. And we're studying what is causing these mangroves to shift. We obviously think it's temperature. And what are the consequences of that? I'm working with a whole group of people from remote sensing to modelers to invertebrate ecologists to biogeochemists and plant ecologists to try and focus in on that topic. And we've been working on this now for the past 4 years, and the project is funded by the National Science Foundation and NASA and is due to come to an end next June, but I feel like we've just gotten started. So mangroves occur around the world, and this is a map to this orange line shows you where mangroves occur. So you see that's primarily in the tropics, in the north about 30 degrees north latitude to about 38 degrees south latitude. And globally, so it's around the world, but globally we divide the mangroves into 2 biogeographic zones. In this part of the world, this hemisphere, we call that the Atlantic East Pacific. And then Australia, Indonesia, on this side of the world is called the Indo-West Pacific. And it's not all that, it sounds a bit arbitrary, but it's not. In this side of the world, the species are different from the ones they're the same genera, but a different group of species here. We have a total of 9 species of mangroves in the neotropics. We've gotten two introduced from Australia. They were introduced to the Fairchild, and they got away. And One of them, Bruguiera, which it came from Australia, is a big plant. It has big propagules, even bigger than this, they were able to eradicate that. But the other one is related to Laguncularia, the white mangrove, has very small propagules, and those are escaped. That's toothpaste out of the tube. It's making itself at home in the Everglades. Anyway, this part of the world has about 60 species of mangroves. You can go into any given mangrove forest in pretty much, well, not anywhere in Australia, but this northern part of Australia, you are faced with 20 different species of mangroves. I recognize the genera, but I don't know what the species are. There's just so many plants, and they're so similar to the ones we know here. But anyway, compare that with salt marshes. This, again, is in sort of a red-orange here. And you see that salt marshes are above 30 degrees for most parts of the world, except for in this one little corner over here, this is Australia. You see that salt marsh distribution overlaps with where mangroves are. So instead of being separated latitudinally, in Australia, you get mangroves and salt marshes being separated tidally. The low intertidal has mangroves, and as you walk into the forest, you come to the salt marshes. There. So the transition from salt marsh to mangroves looks like this. The vegetation, the structure, the plant chemistry, all these traits are changing and affecting ecosystem processes. This is happening here, but this is also happening other places in the world. This is just on the other side of Florida at Deckle Beach. Same latitudes, just a little bit askew, but nevertheless, the salt marshes there are being invaded by mangroves. And this is a salt marsh at Deckle Beach with these little mangroves coming in. There's just hundreds of little baby mangroves coming in here. If you go to Texas, this is Texas Point, right there at Port Arthur, right across the river from Louisiana. You look out and it's just millions of acres of salt marsh, except for these few little mangroves that have made it and have gotten established. If you go to the coast of Louisiana, you see that mangroves have come in there along this very bottom of near the Birdfoot Delta. This is at Port Fourchon. And again, you can see the salt marsh here and these little mangrove trees coming in fast. This is happening in Australia. This is Western Australia, Bunbury. It's the most southern extent of mangroves on the Western Australia. This is a salt marsh system. There's a river out here, and you see all these little mangroves are coming. And as you come away from the river, the mangroves are making their way into the interior. This is on the other side of Australia, in Queensland. It's a Ramsar site just north of Brisbane. Out here where these big trees are, these are big mangroves right along the Pine River. And as you go perpendicular to that shoreline, you get into the interior. This is a huge, beautifully red salt marsh system. But you can see where these bigger, these are still seedlings. But if you got down and looked inside the salt marsh, you can see lots and lots of baby mangroves moving in. So this is not just a phenomenon that's happening here. This is happening throughout the U.S. in the Gulf of California. I have not been to Africa, but I've heard that the same thing is happening there. Certainly in Australia. All these places, it seems to be a function of this, not necessarily a hotter climate, but just not quite as cold a climate. So one of the things we learn about mangroves is that they are very important. They provide lots of important ecosystem functions, goods and services that people value. One of the ones we talk about most is they act as a buffer for nutrients and sediment runoff. In places where mangroves occur along these marine systems, a lot of sediments are washing off from the upland area. So the mangroves trap that and filter the water so that that sediment doesn't go into the sea. They also stabilize the shoreline. They're also protectors from storms. They stabilize and protect the shorelines. This is a big hurricane, a Category 4 hurricane that hit Belize and killed a lot of mangroves, but the mangroves are quickly recovering from that storm. Mangroves are also widely valued for their habitat provision. They serve as nurseries for lots of fishes, including a lot of commercial. I think it's estimated that 70% of the commercial fishes spend part of their life in the mangrove, either as juveniles or moving back into the mangroves to feed. In some areas, mangroves have cultural significance. In Australia, for example, there's lots of evidence that the Aboriginal people there have cultural connections with mangroves. One of the values that has, in the last few years, is sort of overshadowed everything else is carbon sequestration. Have you guys heard of carbon sequestration? So it turns out that mangroves are really good at storing carbon. So living in this anaerobic, salty world, it retards decomposition. So the mangroves are growing above ground, but they're also growing below ground. And they're growing roots and that are not, they're dying, like there's natural turnover, but those roots are not decomposing at the same rate as they are forming. So there's a net accumulation of this undecomposed carbon below ground. This particular graph was put together by Dan Alongi, and he shows here in the middle, this is the carbon stored in mangroves, and he compares that to salt marshes, to seagrass beds, tropical humid evergreen forests, tropical peat swamps. And mangroves is twice what any other system is. This carbon that's stored in these coastal forests or in the ocean is referred to as blue carbon. And blue carbon is, again, it's, I think, become a be-all, end-all for, people are starting to spend their careers on blue carbon, but it's gotten a lot of attention because people are trading blue carbon points. They're trying to figure out how to monetize that and convince people to figure out a way to pay people not to destroy their mangroves, because this blue carbon is sequestering CO2 in the atmosphere that we keep putting there, and the mangroves are storing it very well. So there's a lot of research into blue carbon, and it's happening right here, just like other places. Todd and I share a student, Lorraine Simpson, who just defended her dissertation this week. She did a fantastic job. And she measured blue carbon along this coast of Florida she didn't go all the way to Miami, and she ran into concrete down just south of MacArthur State Park. But she measured carbon in mangroves and salt marshes along this coast. It's a phenomenal amount of work. And here we've got this is the mangroves. This is just an accumulation of all her plots in the pure mangrove world. This is the Ecotone, where we have the mixed mangrove and salt marsh, and this is the pure salt marsh. And you see the mangrove carbon storage, carbon sequestration is higher than in the ecotone or the pure salt marsh. And even within the mangrove, there's a difference. More carbon is being stored in the interior of these forests. It turns out these interior forests, the trees along the fringe are getting flushed. They get most nutrients, they're bigger. The trees in the interior are slower growing, nutrient limited, probably hypersaline, and they are storing more carbon than the trees right along the edge. Another student that I worked with, she did a similar study, but just in one location at the Kennedy Space Center. And she found, this is really nice because they had mapped, the people at NASA had mapped all the different habitats at the Kennedy Space Center in 2003, very detailed map. Then they came back in 2010 and remapped the same areas. So she was able to take these two maps and look at the change in those 7 years as it went from, and there was a discernible change going from more salt marsh back in 2003 to becoming more mangrove by 2010. And she measured how that affected the carbon storage. There was in just that amount of time, just those 7 years, there was a 70% increase in mangrove area, 12% decrease in salt marsh, and the difference was in flooded areas. And let's see if I put the other graph in. Nope, I didn't put the other graph in here. I left the graph out. But nevertheless, there was a huge increase in carbon sequestration. The difference, though, was mainly in above ground biomass. It wasn't so much, in that study, it was not so much below ground or blue carbon. It was the difference in carbon in the above ground. So these trees, I think it's an obvious thing that these trees just are bigger and more perennial and just accumulate much more carbon than these soft herbaceous salt marsh species. So there's lots of reasons to love mangroves, and if you have a list of these things that mangroves do, all the coastal protection, filtering, carbon storage, you make this list with mangroves, you can make the same list for salt marsh. So both of these systems do both of those, or perform all of those different services. Some slightly different, but they are extremely valuable ecosystems. But mangroves have been under threat forever. For a long time, I think probably until the mid-1960s, they were essentially considered wastelands to be filled in, to be diked. If you go to Google Earth and zoom in on the coast, you will see from here, anywhere, you will see remnants of these drag lines and dikes and ditches and impoundments. I mean, I can't believe people were out there with shovels ditching these mangroves. And once they got equipment, they were out there with backhoes digging them and trying to just get rid of them. And then you see old pictures of people doing this, and you read about people trying to drain the mangroves for a couple hundred years. Then in the early 1900s, they figured out that that salt marsh or mosquitoes carried disease. I mean, they figured this out. And somebody had to figure it out. And then the entomologists got into it, and they worked out that these mosquitoes that were making people sick needed to lay their eggs on damp but not flooded soil. So all they had to do was to flood the mangroves or flood the marshes and deprive these mosquitoes of an oviposition site, and they control the mangroves. So that's what they did starting, early 1900s. By 1920s, they were underway, and they were still doing this up into the early 60s. And they were cutting going out with these giant machines and digging ditches and piling the soil up and to create dikes encircling these mangroves. And then they fill those enclosed areas full of water. Well, mangroves, they live in this salty water, but they need to be flushed. They don't live in a one level of water. They need this tidal draining so that the air can get to the root system. So by flooding them, not only did they deprive the mosquitoes of a place to lay their eggs, they kill the mangroves. So I've seen some of these historical photographs of these early impoundments, and it is just, it's like a fire went through it. Just everything is dead. But, you know, there was these guys, in the mid-'60s, a couple of guys down at the University of Miami, Bill Odom and Eric Heald, both of them PhD students working on mangroves, and they published a couple of papers that rocked the world, I think, that they documented that mangrove carbon, mangrove detritus, was fueling the marine food web, and this is what the fish, these commercial fish that were driving up a large part of the economy of Florida, were dependent on those mangroves to provide this detritus. And those publications came out in '67 up to about 1970, I think. And it really did change it got all the way into the legislature. And the laws in Florida were changed a few years thereafter to protect mangroves. But it stems from those guys' work. Then after those papers, the fish guys working at Harbor Branch down in between Vero and Fort Pierce, Grant Gilmore convinced the mosquito control people that if they would open up those impoundments and let the fish back in, that the mangroves would recover. They would create this fish habitat, which would then support the offshore fishes. So the ball was rolling, and they did it. And this is now sort of the standard operating procedure is these impoundments. They're still out there. They're still functioning. They're still being managed. Some of them have been abandoned, not abandoned, but turned into state parks. But there are a lot of impoundments that are still operating as impoundments. But there's water flowing through them. They got healthy mangroves. They got fish. There are big fish coming in, little fish living in there. So things have happened. A lot was done to mangroves, but there have been improvements. There was Florida passed a Wetland Protection Act in around 1984, and this really changed the way mangroves are protected. I don't know about around here, but if you cut down a mangrove in South Florida, you better make sure nobody's watching, because you will go to jail or be fined an awful lot. So that they have taken that to heart. But nowadays, there's still mangrove destruction, and the biggest culprit is shrimp farms. You can go to some places in Indonesia, for example, gorgeous mangrove forests, but they have been absolutely just more than decimated, and converted into shrimp farms, because they worked out how to do industrial scale, what was an artisanal kind of production of making these shrimps and these family farm shrimp farms, but now it's huge industry, and the landscape is not too big for them to convert these mangroves. And the process of doing that pretty much destroys the soil. The soil becomes toxic after 5 to 7 years. So it's very difficult for these systems to be reclaimed. It really takes hard restoration efforts to make them viable systems again. Up until about 2-3 decades, globally, like 35% of the world's mangroves had been destroyed, converted from something else, impounded, diked, filled in, like Maria Sanchez's marsh over there. But once they started with the industrial shrimp farming, it was, and that was in the late 80s, early 90s when this industrial shrimp farm started. So we had all this information that proved the value of these systems. But despite knowing all of that, there's so much money in these shrimp farms that it does not matter. And it's not just in Indo-Pacific, it's not just Vietnam, but in the Caribbean as well, in Honduras, Brazil, in Belize. And there's now, if you fly down the coast of Belize, you'll see there's as many derelict farms as there are active ones, but there's no law in the book that anyone has to restore those systems. Anyway, this is what I just said. So coming back to getting off of my soapbox, okay, some evidence of climate change. This is a photograph I took in, I don't know, about 2005. This is at Black Point Drive down at Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge. As you go along there, you'll see this sign that tells you this is a salt marsh you're looking at out there. And it tells you what species you're seeing and some of the ecological things that are going on. But 2005, and if you look at that same place, or if you zoom in on that side, you can see these little things here. I can point them out. These little glistening things. Those are little mangrove trees, right? So even in 2005, that system that you're looking at, the sign tells you, I don't know when that sign was put up, but it says it's a salt marsh. It was already probably 50% mangrove, little mangroves. But if you go there now, this is a picture I just took. It's pretty much a mangrove forest. These trees are 4 meters tall and have completely filled that system in. So just in that amount of time, that system has changed. We have measured, try to come up with a measure of this rate of change that's happened. My postdoc, who has gone on to having a proper job, did a remote sensing study. He pulled together Landsat images from 1984 to 2011, and he analyzed all these systems and put it together with, plant responses to different temperatures. And what he found was that there's this huge increase as you go from South Florida to north. You can see there's more than 100% increase in mangrove cover in this part of the state during that time. Between 1984 and 2011, there's this huge increase in mangroves. And it's correlated, very tight relationship between the change in the number of days below 3 to 4 degrees Celsius. So since between that time period, we had fewer days that got cold enough to limit the mangroves. So the mangroves moved up, and we see outside the impact of that. So and those are what, how many years? 30 years? Kyle, this postdoc Kyle, also modeled those data for the different. We did some physiological studies to see the cold tolerance of the 3 different species, and the white mangrove is the most cold intolerant. Then the red mangrove next, and then the black mangrove is the most cold tolerant. And using those tolerance levels and the predicted climate change over the next 50 years, he put together this model to predict where they would be by 2060. And as you can see, over here is, you're not, that doesn't show you that, does it? all the while. There. So this is for black mangrove. So by 2060, the climate envelope should be suitable for mangroves up to about Brunswick, Georgia. For the red mangrove, it's here right around the St. Mary's River, and similarly for the white mangrove. But one of the little problems with this is the starting point here. When we first started looking for these mangroves, we were trying to find the northernmost mangrove in order to have, this is the starting point and where do they go. And it turns out we didn't really find the northernmost mangroves. You have to look really hard to find those. They're hiding out there. So the starting point, this green area is the current, what he says is the current mangrove. So it would probably be maybe right there. So this is where mangroves are now and would have been when Kyle did this analysis. And for red mangrove, it would also be right about there. So you gotta be careful sometimes. But I think this was a good beginning. We spent yesterday looking. I seem to spend a lot of my time looking for that northernmost mangrove. And yesterday we got out in the marshes up by Fort George Inlet and Big Talbot, and sure enough, this is a red mangrove that's right up there on Fort George Inlet. And then this is a good size, looks like it's about 3.5, 4 meters tall, up on the very north side of Big Talbot Island. So I tried to estimate the age of these plants. And these trees aren't like, you go out, if you have a maple in your yard or something, you can use bud scale scars and estimate, not even estimate, you can count how old your tree is. These guys don't have bud scale scars, but they do have growth patterns that you can, especially the young plants that aren't so old, you can estimate. And I estimated from counting these growth patterns from the top to the bottom. This plant is about 12 to 14 years old. This little tree is only, I would guess, probably not more than about 6 or 8 years old. This is this little star here. This star. I had a road trip. This is in 2004, the spring of 2004. We came up here from Fort Pierce pulling a boat and looking for the northernmost mangrove. So this is where, who knows? We looked hard, but it's very hard to get into all those marshes. You can't, you're down the boat, you can't see back there. But anyway, we found little black mangroves here. These mangroves are still here, and they're good-sized trees. But this is our northernmost mangrove in 2004. And that was spring of 2004. At the end of 2004, we had these visitors, Francis and Jeannie, if you guys remember those storms, that came up the coast. And I suspect that they delivered a lot of mangrove propagules and probably seeded these systems. And what we're seeing now at these northern edges of some of these 12 to 14-year-old estimated plants were likely planted by one of those storms. So we have another study here looking at trying to look a little bit longer time scale. Here, just right here, this is pretty much right where we are right now. And this is another postdoc, a remote sensing guy that I worked with. And this I'm going to just zoom in, so I want you to know where we are. right there is the spot. So here's Matanzas Inlet, you know, right where we are. If we go in a little closer, this is still Matanzas Inlet, right? It's this marsh right here. And if you go in just a little bit closer, you'll see that's the marsh. And you see this pond here? I think this is a sinkhole because it has never changed shape. Anyway, that's an orienting point for you. So my colleague put together a series of pond, yes. He got in touch with the image library, the historical image library at the University of Florida. And I don't know if you know this, but there's this phenomenal collection of historical aerial photographs, every square inch of the Florida coast, starting, I think, the earliest are 1942. There might be some earlier ones, but from 42 up through the late 60s, literally black and white aerial photographs of every square inch of the land. And the University of Florida has scanned all those images and has made them available free. So, my colleague, Wilfred Rodriguez, got those images, and then we also got a high-resolution digital or WorldView 2 image that he could use to georeference them, because they're just black and white photographs, but they are vertical. They're nearly perfectly vertical, but he still had to georeference them. And there you can see the pond, right? And that's the same pond in all these images, so they're all been georeferenced. And you know, you're looking at each one exactly the same. So he did image analysis, or what remote sensing guys do on all of these images, and quantified how much was mangrove and how much was salt marsh. And you look here, you say 1942, there couldn't have been any mangroves there then. Nobody would find any mangroves there, right? So it's a little hard to see, but he then put it into, he color-coded it for me so I could see it. And you can see in 42, the green here, the green is the mangrove, the gold is the salt marsh. And you see there's a little mangrove there. 52 is even more, a lot. And then 71, it goes down, and then 80, it goes down, and then it goes up again. So this same little spot, you know, the mangrove have been there, and they've disappeared, and they've come back again. So he made a graph to show that change through time. So here's that 42 image. There was very little mangrove, but by 52, half of the area was covered in mangroves. And then it goes down again, and then it goes down and down and down, and then it goes up again. So there was something driving that. So I superimposed on top of that freeze events. That we know a lot about freezes in Florida, more than you might think. The citrus people can tell you about freezes, and it turns out I think, I haven't done the test, but citrus, oranges, and mangrove tolerate freeze about the same. And the citrus people have detailed records of when it was cold enough to kill the oranges and when it was not. And those paralleled very nicely with mangroves. But also in here, click. Off the charts here, we know that in 1940 there was a deep impact freeze. Was that an impact freeze? An impact freeze, and I don't know if you've heard that term, but this is a citrus industry term. They refer to a freeze that is bad, that is severe enough to cause the growers to move the groves further south. That's an impact freeze. So there's impact freezes and there's freezes that are just severe. But there's an impact freeze before here, but then there's also a hurricane. In 1944, the Florida-Cuba hurricane hit St. Augustine. There's pictures on the web. It was just, far worse than Matthew. The whole front part of the city was destroyed, and somebody put these pictures on the web, and I really appreciate that. And the storm came up the coast in early October, when mangroves would have been full of propagules. So it hit here, carried propagules, and I think what happens, it seeded the marshes. And they establish, but then you get these cold snaps. These are polar, the news refers to them as polar vortexes or polar outbreaks. There's a 1962 was an impact freeze. 1977 was a major freeze, although it wasn't an impact freeze. Then here in the 80s was a cluster of freezes from 81, 83, 85, 89. Where 83 and 89 were severe freezes. 89 was, I think, people think of that as reconfiguring Florida in its severity. And then out here, these are the two. This is when Hurricane Francis and Jeannie hit, and following that, we get a big increase in mangroves. So it's, maybe this is just a smoking gun, and I'd like to have another oscillation to know for sure, but still, I think this is suggestive that there's something going on between mangrove distribution, where they are, where they aren't, with hurricanes and freeze events as being major reshapers of this coastal system. This is the paper that I showed you earlier, where Kyle did put all the Landsat images together from 84 to 2011. This is the time frame that was covered there. And you can see it's mainly an increase. It goes from nothing to a lot following this hurricane. And now we have this new event out here. And who knows what's going to happen from that. We'd probably get mangroves to North Carolina, huh? So herein starts to build some of the historical stuff to try and I guess convince myself and convince others that there's something going on. We have a timeline of those freezes that the citrus industry, this is their They put out this list of impact freezes or near impact freezes dating from 1835. 1835 was a major freeze event, and in this part of the world, in 1834, there would have been, St. Augustine is described as a city inside an orange grove. There would have been big orange trees completely occupying St. Augustine. In fact, they were growing oranges up into Georgia. And when that freeze hit, that stopped that. They killed all the oranges all the way, pushed that orange line back to about the frost-proof area. And each of those impact freezes just pushed it a little further south. And these 5, see where I put the blue markers? These are the ones that are considered severe enough to be impact freezes, to be this, cause these growers to plant their groves further south. And if you plot these out, this is the timeline where those freezes are from 1835 to close to the present. And for the period that Wilfred did with all the satellite historical photographs, it's 70 years. So we still have a lot of unknowns in the past to try and figure out, were there mangroves here? Are we seeing, is it literally, we know that the climate is shifting, but have there never been mangroves here? And so I think in order to understand whether it's climate change or how it's climate change, we really have to get as much as we can out of the past to really be definitive of what climate change is doing to these systems. So the most recent impact freeze was in 1989. Kyle put together a series of Landsat images from this is just before the freeze. Right up here is Fort Pierce Inlet. So you can see it's all green. That's all mangrove swamp there. And this is 91, just after that 1989 freeze. And you can see all the mangroves, all the green is gone. And talking to people who have lived through that freeze in 1980, it's not so long ago, right? So people remember that. And the facilities manager at the Smithsonian in Fort Pierce told me that looking out her door, there were no live mangroves left after that freeze of 1989. And you can see there doesn't look to be anything alive here. But just a couple years later, it's already green. And maybe that's all new seedlings, but those seedlings have got to come from someplace. There's got to be live trees making new propagules, or it's trees that were just damaged and they've resprouted. So I suspect that everything wasn't 100% killed. Things were killed back, but not so much that they couldn't regrow or, right? So you can see at 91, it's gone. In 93, you start to get some green again. By 97, it's all green. So going from less than 10 years, you get the system returning to being a mangrove. Suggests to me that I suppose it could be all seedlings in there, but there are a lot of big trees. If you go down there, you see big trees that are probably more than 10 years old, that are probably 500 years old, or they could be 500 years old. So they weren't killed. And I can imagine that bigger trees are more resistant, the wood is thicker, that they would tolerate those deep freezes. And going back from 89, there was a freeze in 1977. It got down to 12 degrees Fahrenheit in St. Augustine in 1977. You can go on to the Weather Underground and look at, and these freezes, these cold, these outbreaks don't just come and go away. They come down and they spend about 3 or 4 days. So every night you get these freezes that last for hours. The orange people have got it worked out. They measure how long it was below 28 degrees and how long it was below 22 degrees. We haven't done that for mangroves. But nevertheless, if the oranges are killed, the mangroves are probably killed. And they had snow in Miami. The 100%, there's a paper that the mosquito control people did of the mangroves in the salt marshes along this Atlantic coast, and 100% mangrove dead at the north end. They just went to the top of Volusia County, and everything was dead. All species of mangroves were dead. And as you go south, it was you go, I think down into Martin County, there started to be some living mangroves. But there were mangroves killed down into the Keys. For example, these are really poor photographs, but I found a paper that a guy had worked, he was working on fire, but he had these pictures of after the freeze event. This is from the Everglades in January 97. And these are, I believe, are black mangrove trees. And you can see inside these black mangrove trees are some green. So the tops and the small branches were killed, but not the whole plant wasn't killed. It was able to sprout back out and grow. This, however, is a red mangrove forest. Red mangrove forests don't do that. If you kill the apical bud on a red mangrove, you kill the entire tree. And this is in the Everglades with these big stands of red mangroves killed by that 77 freeze. So we have, if it happened here, if this is the Everglades, here everything would have been dead. So that 77 storm or freeze event would have reset what this system looked like. Even if mangroves had gotten here the next day after that freeze, they wouldn't have been here, or there'd be dead stems. So going back from that I have been amazed at how little studied these freeze events are. Almost no publications on the effects of these freeze events on mangroves have been, maybe people document, the one from 77 that the mosquito control guys did, that is one of the few things I've found where people systematically went to the mangrove and said how severely they were damaged following these impact freezes. But there is evidence in the historical literature, little tidbits of information, a line here. Nobody has written a book about this, but it's buried in obscure little things that have been copied onto the Florida Historical Gazette. This one, for example, this record about Audubon went to visit Bulow at Bulow Creek down by Tomoka State Park. In 1835, and must have been right when the freeze event happened. Audubon was there to get a brown pelican specimen, and Bulow took him down Bulow Creek, which is now Bulow Creek. I don't think it was Bulow Creek then, but took him down to the Halifax River, and they ran aground on a mangrove island and almost froze to death. This came from a letter from Bulow's wife to her sister in Massachusetts. And it was just recorded in the Florida Historical Gazette. So just little bits and pieces, wonderful stuff from the Historical Society in St. Augustine. But if we start at the earliest that I found, Bartram actually recorded seeing a black mangrove on Anastasia Island in 1765. So mangroves were here. Bartram would have known. 1788, André Michaud, who was the first trained botanist to visit North America, he was sent to gather plants to take back to France. And he saw both Avicennia and Rhizophora, so both black and red mangrove on Anastasia Island. He also saw red mangrove down at Turtle Mound, down by Canaveral National Seashore. Charles Vignoles was the city surveyor in St. Augustine. He was a railroad engineer from England, but he came to St. Augustine. Anyway, he did this spectacular map of Florida, but he also did a book on Florida. And this is actually available on Google Books. I just searched and found it, and it's a phenomenal book. The guy defines his terms. He's not a botanist, but he defines his terms, and he's got a glossary, and he says mangrove. He says this is tree with these prop roots hanging down. He doesn't tell me it's Rhizophora mangli, but just from his description, you know bloody well what it is. And it's not like a black mangrove; it's a red mangrove, is what he's talking about. And he reported mangroves at Dunlawton Bridge. So those are not black mangroves; those are red mangroves from his description. Another thing that he says, Ponce Inlet. This is a great book to get because you will learn a lot. You can just search on Google Books and you can find this. But he describes Ponce Inlet, and he's writing this book for people who want to come to Florida to develop and do stuff. So if you're coming from Massachusetts and you're coming down the coast by ship and you're going to come in the Ponce Inlet, he says that you can come in with a boat with a 10-foot draft. And I checked out what a boat coming from Massachusetts with a 10-foot draft would be. It would be a 150-foot schooner. This is a big boat. But you then come in the inlet, and you can go, the barrier island just south of Ponce Inlet. You go down that barrier island, and you can tie up your 150-foot schooner on a mangrove tree. This is not one of these little puny things we have here. This is a tree, It must, and we know from his glossary that he's talking about red mangrove. So these would have been huge red mangrove trees if you're going to tie up a boat on it, a ship. This is Jacob Retmont was a surgeon. He was sent to Florida in 1835, 36, to be the physician to the immigrating Indians. You know, the Indians were going to be rounded up and they were going to so peacefully go out to Oklahoma. Well, they decided not to go. And he became the physician to the army who was fighting the Second Seminole War. And he kept a journal of the time he was there for 3 years. And he kept a journal. And they left from St. Augustine, headed south, went to New Smyrna, met up with the guys on the horses, and some of them went by land and some of them went by water. And as you go south from New Smyrna, you go through this narrows area with maze of islands, Canaveral National Seashore to seaward. And this was in 1836, the year after this big impact freeze, and he describes what he's seeing there, which is all these dead mangrove islands. And he describes these trees as things with all these prop roots hanging off of them. He doesn't say red mangrove, but what he describes are red mangroves. And he has a nice little vignette in there talking about these dead trees had all these white birds perched in them, reminded him of cotton fields back home. Anyway, this is an interesting book. His journal, he completed after I think 1838 was when he went home. So that's when he finished that journal. That book wasn't published until 1954. So somehow that manuscript just languished until somebody found it and published it. But it's a really nice history. It tells you a lot about Florida. I just discovered this book, A 1,000-Mile Walk to the Gulf by John Muir. He has one sentence in there, but on mangroves. And he gets off the ferry at Fernandina, and he talks about seeing mangroves out in the marsh. This 1,000-mile walk was in 1867. It didn't get published. The book didn't get published until, I think, 1916, something like that. But this is the northernmost historical record that I've found. And John Muir was a botanist, so I have to believe that if he says he saw mangroves, that he saw mangroves. This is a bird publication. This guy, Nicholson, he reports finding Magillivary seaside sparrow nesting in small mangrove trees on Merritt Island. So you know, there are not supposed to be any mangroves at Merritt Island. They weren't supposed to be there. But if he actually put a photograph, did it come? He actually puts a photograph in his paper, this 1928 paper. And you see, this is this huge salt marsh here, and there's little mangrove, just like this. And he tells me how high above the ground the little birds are nesting. But I think the most interesting part here is this snag here in the foreground. This is a dead black mangrove snag. It's just, I mean, you can tell, right? So even in 1928, mostly salt marsh with a few mangroves, but sometime in the past there were some really big black mangroves there. There's some other evidence of mangrove shifting from salt marsh to mangroves to salt marsh. This is one of my favorite things that I ran across. This guy, Frank Chapman, was at the Smithsonian, and he had a friend at the American Museum of Natural History who found this new species of muskrat, round-tailed muskrat. He found it on Merritt Island. And so Frank Chapman wanted to work out the natural history of this muskrat, so he goes to Florida and looks for it to try and figure out how this muskrat makes a living. And he found it south of Merritt Island near Sebastian Inlet. And where he finds this muskrat in this big area that he calls it a savanna. And it's salt marsh with these occasional mangroves. He's got one he calls yellow mangrove. I don't know what that is, but it's probably white mangrove. And a few small mangroves out in there and around the edge, but he describes a salt marsh. But he finds where the round-tailed muskrat is nesting, and it's nesting in the stump of a big, old, dead black mangrove. So in what was this, 1889, by Sebastian Inlet, it would have looked like the Ecotone here, with salt marsh with some mangroves in it. But if you go there now, it's 100% red mangrove. But in 1889, it looked like here, but there's evidence that it was at some time in the earlier it had been a huge mangrove forest. This is looking east to the west, and this is where he found this muskrat nesting. There was industry that has gone away, and I don't think it's ever going to come back. But in the late 1800s, people were growing bees in the area around Oak Hill, New Smyrna, and it turned out that black mangrove was the most productive honey plant out there. I mean, it sounds like it was the most productive plant. Then these freezes of the late 1800s, 1895, 1894, 95, and 1899 were major freeze events, kill these trees, and the bee industry collapsed following those. And this guy who wrote this article said it had not recovered. This is written in 1918. In the 20 years after the freeze events, there hadn't been a recovery of the mangrove. So these little historical studies, I mean, I never had thought about checking out a beekeeping journal, but there it is. So it seems that the scale of disturbance really has important implications for mangroves. If we look at the way we think of this is the top of the ecotone. You know, the ecotone would be this whole area, but this leading edge, you get cold periods or you get hurricanes, and there's probably push mangroves. The hurricanes push mangroves north, and then the freeze events push them back. But there's just a gradual, a small oscillation. I can visualize that there's probably not even 2 degrees of change, maybe a 1 degree of latitude kind of shift back and forth. But, and it sets up this stability, you know. And most people literally do not believe there's mangroves here. So you get these frequent but relatively small disturbances that create this sort of stable setting. But ever so often, you get these really big events, like you get a hurricane. And not just any hurricane, a big hurricane that comes up the coast, comes late in the season, so it has a potential of picking up lots of propagules from many places further south and just mixing them up. You know, the genetics are just created a new configuration of these populations here. And then you also have these large freeze events that push back the other way. So my view of that is you get this change, but then you have these two opposing major types of disturbances that have not just a little change, but a major change. Under normal conditions, no storm, mangroves disperse tens of meters. You know, this tree made a propagule. This propagule maybe goes 20, 30 meters away from the mama tree before it takes root. But under a storm event, it goes tens of kilometers away. So anyway, similar to other species, climate change is causing a poleward shift in the distribution, phenology, and abundance of mangroves and mangrove-associated species. That's happening along the coast of Florida and other places around the world. Mangroves are further north now than they have been found before, with one exception, John Muir. Okay. not just the mangroves are expanding, but the mangrove-associated fauna is expanding with their host plants. These mangroves are the foundation to the system, and so they are habitat that's shifting, and the organisms that live there are shifting. The historical records coupled with recent data show that mangrove shifts are happening now and have happened in the past. They are not so gradual. They seem to be or monotonic. This is not just happening in one direction. We get expansion, but we've also got contraction that has been documented repeatedly, I think, in this historical literature. And the long-term patterns don't support the idea that it's just mangroves marching or creeping. I think it suggests more a mangrove leaping or jumping. I think it happens episodically, so that there's under these sort of stable conditions, you get this creeping change within a certain amount of latitude, but these giant jumps are happening episodically. So I hypothesize that the recent range expansion is not only because of fewer freeze events, but also a combination of fewer freeze coupled with long-distance dispersal through storm events that are strong enough and at the right time of the year to disperse mature propagules. And we predict that mangroves' range contraction will continue to occur in response to these severe freeze events. There's a lot of disagreement in the literature. I try to read the climatological literature. It is very complicated. Some people are saying that these polar outbreaks or polar vortexes or whatever are going to be fewer and fewer. Some people say that the melting of the ice cap is going to make there be more. Some people say whenever we get a neutral phase of El Nino in the Pacific, we're going to get a polar out. There's just a lot of speculation. Plus they're happening, I don't know if you noticed, there seem to be clusters of these freeze events. Cluster in the 80s, there's a cluster in the 1890s. Some people say that there's this multi-decadal pattern that's there, which is, I mean, how do you measure something like that? Anyways, I think there's a lot of speculation here on my part, but there's a lot of speculation in the climatological literature as well. It's being modeled, and anyway. So that's my story, and I hope you like that.